Easy, child, easy. I can lead you to others like you. Humans, won't that be nice?
Hi, today I'm going to be talking about Darksiders 3, an action-adventure hack-and-slash game that is clearly inspired by the Dark Souls franchise. You play as Fury of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, hacking your way through varied enemies and environments on your way to defeat the 7 deadly sins.
My sole concern is comfort.
In this video I'm going to be talking specifically about the weapons and how they affect the game. There are 6 main weapons in the game, and these include the whip, the chains, the lance, and salvation. There are also 2 other weapons, but I won't be talking about them in this video. So how the weapons work in this game is that there are 2 weapons which can't be switched out. So this is the whip and salvation, the whip being the weapon you start with and it's the weapon that's on the box art and everything, and then salvation you get more towards the middle of the game. The rest of the weapons are what I'd consider secondary weapons. You can't use them at the same time and you have to switch between them when you want to use them. So the first weapon I'm going to be talking about is the first one you get, the whip. This is Fury's signature weapon. The most important thing about this weapon is that it's a constant. The player will always have access to it. And since the player will always have access to it, the designers can take advantage of that. That means the whip is the baseline weapon for the player. So, there could be a gap that you need to use your whip to swing across to get to. And because the player will always have access to this weapon, they can put it in from the beginning and just keep using that trick throughout the game. The whip also plays an important part in the combat. You can use it to pull enemies towards you if you pull off a special move. This means that flying enemies can be grounded and anyone that's trying to run away can be pulled back. This allows a bit more flexibility in the enemy design department, since they can have enemies that attack you from a distance or try and run away or fly, and they'll be safe knowing that the player can always deal with that issue, even from the beginning. Another thing that the whip contributes to the game is it makes movement more fun. As an example, it allows the player to swing off a platform, attack an enemy mid-air, then hit them against the floor, dealing damage in a radius around Fury. Enjoyability of the movement makes it so that the game feels more dynamic. The player is more likely to move around a lot more and incorporate the movement into their combat, which will mean the player is more likely to dodge attacks and take less damage from them. The first secondary weapon the player gets are the chains. These are given long after the player has been teased with indestructible webs that lay around the world, as well as ledges that are just way too high to jump up to. With this new weapon comes a new form for Fury to take. Her hair turns a bright red, and then when she jumps and then jumps again, she turns into a rocket and blows herself upwards. She also gets the ability to do a heavy move which sets things on fire when she lands it. This means she can finally destroy all those webs that have been laying around the levels. It's worth noting that before this, the player can actually destroy the webs, but they're only available to be destroyed in certain locations where certain bugs are, and then the player has to destroy some kind of sticky goo which the bug sucks up and becomes a bomb. Not gonna lie, there's no way of saying it without it sounding weird, but at least now the player doesn't have to do that anymore and they can just destroy it wherever they happen to be. So the player gets this ability, they can see what it can do, and then they realise, hold on, I saw some webs back there. And now, this is the first point where the player can do some real backtracking. And this isn't just good for expanding playtime, but it also makes the player become more familiar with the world and, in the future, look out for more areas which may be reserved for a new power-up. In terms of combat, the chains are much faster paced than the whip, and they also do fire damage, meaning the player now has a way of doing passive damage to an enemy. They can use this tactically in a fight by waiting for an opening, such as after an enemy has done a heavy attack, then they can just do a fire slam attack and set the guy on fire, which causes the enemy to take continuous damage over time. This gives more options to the player, and it's great for one-on-one encounters where you can just whittle them down and then hide so that you can heal, for example. Right, so next up is the lance. The lance is the second auxiliary weapon the player's given, and by this point they've gotten a hang of how the combat works, and hopefully how how to utilize two weapons at the same time. With the lance, the player is also given an electricity form which turns Fury's hair yellow and allows her the ability to glide. Speaking of gliding, that means a player can now cross a gap when they're at a height. It also means that the player can cross the tornado-looking things within the map and can be used to fly upwards, leading to more areas the player can explore. Because of this ability, movement is once again emphasized, but since only one of these abilities can be used at a time, it replaces the double jump when the player uses it. It's interesting that either of these weapons will give you some sort of movement bonus, but it also means each one's unique and all the abilities will be used for certain puzzles, and each one is relatively unique for different combat situations. This means there's going to be constant back and forth between different weapons as you need them. This is in contrast to games such as, I know it's not the best example, but Call of Duty, since in Call of Duty most of the weapons within their class are basically the same thing. They just have like certain parameters tweaked, so one will shoot faster, one will do more damage but shoot slower, that kind of thing. But you essentially just level up the one weapon you like best and that's really it. You won't go and play with the others unless you're just trying them out, but in this case you will. Next up, and we're back to the combat again. Because of the electricity form, that means there are more combat abilities the player can now use. So when the player uses a charged attack with the lance, they hit the enemy and then electricity hits the enemies nearby, shocking them all and stunning them as well. This means the player can use this tactically against large groups of enemies, which wasn't as easy to do before. They can stun them all and shock them all, and while they're stunned they can just get some hits on them. Personally, I feel like this makes the player feel like they're progressing well. It makes them feel like they can suddenly take on huge amounts of enemies at once without being attacked. And I think this makes it way more fun, especially with all the special effects going on in the background. Now I just want to talk about weapon choice. So, the choice between weapons gives an interesting decision for the player to make in combat, because up to this point they only had the chains and the whip, but now, when they get into a fight with an enemy, they have to pick the right tool for the job, since you can't have both at once. Your favourite weapon might not be the guaranteed answer to a particular enemy. For example, you might be dealing with hordes of enemies, but your fire weapon is your favourite. It doesn't really work out as well when you can just use the electricity, stun them and chain lightning them. And of course there's the fact that there are certain puzzles that require certain weapons to complete. Right, so on to the last weapon I'm going to talk about in this video, Salvation. Salvation is a kind of glaive-like weapon, and unlike the lance and the chains, it's not a secondary/auxiliary weapon. It's its own weapon that, like the whip, the player will always have available. So what the Salvation allows the player to do is aim at up to 4 enemies, and then when you attack, you throw the weapon and then it will follow the path of those 4 enemies, hitting them in the process. So that means we've gotten our first ranged weapon. So what I find interesting about this weapon from a design perspective is that the player gets it after getting to the Archangel at the end of a level filled with, well, angels. I think this is a really interesting way of introducing the usefulness of the weapon, since the angels are airborne. And up to this point, your best chance of hitting an airborne enemy is either by knocking them to the ground or smacking them with your whip. But if there's some ranged enemies that are in the sky, you're kinda screwed. So essentially, you go through this area full of flying enemies that you're less able to attack, really, because they're flying. But at the same time, once the players struggled through and got to the end, they get rewarded with the one weapon, which can make it a hell of a lot easier to take them down in the future. An interesting thing about this weapon is it has no elemental damage attached to it like the other 2 weapons did, but it's okay since you always have access to it. That means that whatever element you're already playing as will actually transfer to it. So the player can pick the electricity form and shock the enemies out of the sky, or pick the fire form and set them alight with fire damage. This just adds the choices the players can make. For example, the player could be fighting a group of enemies, and if some begin running away, they can just charge up Salvation and electrocute them. And since it's electricity, it will hurt them more as a group since they get hit by the lightning chain. They could also set a big flying enemy on fire before attacking the weaker grunts. As the progression has worked before, it gives more incentive for the player to use different attacks at the same time to deal as much damage as possible. Outside of fights, Salvation also has its own utility. You can charge it up with a certain element, and then when you throw it, you can hit certain pods that match that element, and then when you do that, it will drop an item for the player to pick up. I know personally, once I realised what this could do, I ended up backtracking to get as many of the items as possible. So I'm sure the player would do too. Now that I've spoken about the weapons that I want to end it by talking about the general design, area unlocking, and just an ending summary. The weapons I've discussed seem like a small part of the game's overall design, but they're essential when it comes to the design of other parts of the game. What weapons the player has access to, and what each weapon is capable of, affects exactly what the enemy and level designers can do with the game. You can't just have flying enemies attacking the player from the beginning, as they would only have the jump attack to deal with them, if they can even reach that height. The main example I have being the journey to the Archangel, which is filled with flying enemies, and that means the first time the player visits that area, they'll likely find it more difficult to defeat them. But as soon as they get Salvation, it's a hell of a lot easier. I think it's interesting that the developers have made it so that the weapons are the key to unlocking new areas as well. It's a way of making the player feel like they're in this huge, expansive world, when really it's just a bunch of linear levels stitched together. The linear/open world style makes it so the player is less likely to get lost, but at the same time, they can easily just wander around and find new areas that they've not seen before because didn't have a certain ability before. It also increases the playtime of the game, and makes areas much more memorable since the player's seen them so many times. The elemental damage, the weapon variation, and the attacks that come from it really help make the experience more fun. The player is slowly introduced to all these mechanics after being taught the older mechanics, which makes it much less daunting to get into. And as they become better with the abilities, the player performs better and finishes fights with many more combinations of attacks used, particle effects flying everywhere and less damage taken. It makes the player feel good about how they're performing, but the game isn't made any easier. Thanks for watching. I hope you got something out of this, or in the very least were a little bit entertained by it. I'm not sure what game to do next, but if you have any ideas, do put it in the comments section. It's always good to get a bit of interaction. Also, you could do the whole like and subscribe thing if you wanted to. I wouldn't mind.
Muster up a little dignity.
Sweetheart, I let slaves wipe my ass with the wings of angels while I enjoy a morning tea.